Okay, so you are recording and you are streaming.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Chelsea Land Use Committee meeting for April. My name is Betty McIntosh. My co-chair, Paul Devlin, is here. There's waving his hand. Per the governor's order, we have been meeting remotely, and this meeting is being recorded and is currently live streaming on YouTube and will be accessible later. The materials for tonight are public and can be viewed on the Community Board 4 website. I encourage you to sign up for e-blast. This is a message to the public, obviously, to get the agenda and link to documents for meetings beforehand. So if you're here for the first time, 3 things to know about the process. After each presentation, first, the committee will comment, then members of the public, known as the attendees, will be able to speak, and this discussion goes back to committee. On some agenda items, committee members next vote to write a letter of support or make other recommendations. And very important for you to know how to get your voice heard. So to comment or ask questions after a presentation, after the committee speaks, you must press the raised hand button on your screen. For me, it's usually on the bottom towards the right. If you are calling in, star *9 to raise your hand, and star or *6 to unmute. Did I cover everything, Jesse? Oh, well.
Betty, I have to say, you have done this. You have done one of the best intros I've ever heard.
That's because you gave it to Maria, and I asked Maria for that. Anyway, it's from you. So we have a full agenda tonight. Committee update about an inventory we're doing on hotels and office spaces. We're going to second discuss policy recommendations on residential conversions. And third, the Empire Station Complex project update. So I'm going to do number 1 for the agenda, and Paul is going to do number 2 and 3. So my update is of the volunteers field inventory of hotels and office buildings. As you know, the state and city are proposing to convert distressed hotels and office buildings into residential uses, such as housing with 25% affordable units, supportive housing and shelters for people who are homeless. I actually just, in yesterday's newspaper, there's a big article about this topic. Community Board 4 aims to be proactive and develop a sound strategy to anticipate these programs. We want to advocate for sensible locations for conversions by identifying areas that are oversaturated with certain uses and locations that would be ideal for such residential uses. To allow us to produce such a sound strategy, we are creating an inventory of distressed properties that might be candidates for conversions. To this end, I organized volunteers with the help of Pam, who's in our circle here, for getting information about hotels and office buildings in Chelsea. Hell's Kitchen volunteers have embarked on a similar effort. The inventory will be mapped and could also include existing social service facilities, shelters, for homeless people, and affordable housing. You will have, if you've checked the Dropbox, you'll find some of these documents already were here. They just came in a short time ago, so you may. Chelsea Land Use Committee meeting, we asked for fieldwork volunteers and fortunately got enough people for the survey work. We started this effort in mid-March by creating a package of materials for each volunteer that included maps with existing hotels and office buildings. So volunteers could easily note on a table whether or not they were open or closed, their condition, for instance, boarded up or, for sale sign, other details about it. And we divided Chelsea into 6 survey areas. As of April 15th, the field data has been collected for all of Chelsea. Pretty good. We're grateful for certain volunteers. Viren organized city, Do It, and Pluto data for hotels and office buildings.
Is anyone else having trouble with Betty's connection?
Yes,
Betty, we can't hear you. You've gone out.
I am.
Prepared Excel spreadsheet.
Betty?
You can't hear me?
No, Betty, your connection is spotty, and all the people you're thanking aren't hearing you thank them.
Well, what do you suggest I do?
I don't know.
Repeat.
Jesse, what should I do? Nobody can hear me?
You seem to be connected well now, so start again. Start with the thank yous. The Excel spreadsheet that was created by is the last we heard.
Okay. We're very grateful for I'll try to speak quickly. We're very grateful for these volunteers. Viren organized data and prepared Excel spreadsheets and maps. In addition to Paul and I, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. What? What? I'm cut out?
Twee and Pam, can you mute, please?
Okay.
Thank you. Go on, Betty.
Okay, here we go. Alan Oster, Pam Wolf, Carrie Keenan, and Paul Grodnick. Savannah Wu, who works for Clinton Housing Development Company, where Joe Restuccia is executive director, has been essential to this project. She prepared maps for the field work, has been she finished entering the field data into Excel spreadsheets, and she added missing data that we didn't quite catch up with. And she is preparing maps with hotels and office buildings, reflecting the information from the field surveys. What did our field surveys show? You might want to know. This is hot off the press. For Chelsea, we found 35 hotels, and 9 of them were distressed or closed. And there were 20 small hotels, that's 150 rooms or less. And 7 of these small hotels were distressed and closed. So not too much distress, but some. We found 70 office buildings, and 6 out of the 70 were distressed or closed, according to our observations. It could be some were closed and we didn't notice it, but we did our best to try to find that out. And so you can see that there are double the number of hotels for office buildings, which is not surprising, I think. So in your Dropbox, which you may not have gotten to, Savannah has this amazing map, which is for all of Community District 4, a little microscopic, but it kind of shows an overview of Hell's Kitchen and Chelsea, and you'll see there's many more colors and doodads on the Hell's Kitchen part. So we have less of these things. And Savannah just, they asked her to divide Chelsea into just north and south, and she just made those maps. And I think, Jesse, you put these in Dropbox too, right? The things that Savannah just sent?
I believe I did. I put the ones that Paul suggested. I updated both the policy recommendations, which are changes done and.
So anyway, so
And that
they
just
look
goes-
like this and they're easier to view. And so at some point, we will be making recommendations about this based on our data, with their proximity.
Today,
Well, I don't think we're going to say this spot versus that spot. We're going to give general recommendations, but in terms of this is the ideal place, you should put a conversion or have a conversion, this is the general. So Paul is going to talk about the policy recommendations on a large scale, not building by building. But are there any questions?
Just one tiny thing. Paul, that was the volunteer in Chelsea, is Paul Gronke is his name.
Oh, sorry.
I want to make sure because people will
Okay.
be confused.
Okay, Ronky, I should have asked you ahead of time. Okay. So now let's see. Do we go to the public to see if they have any questions about this, Jesse?
can
I
I,
used the raised hand function.
yeah, can we, Twee raise your hand, and can I suggest that we get into the policy overview before we open it up for public comment? Let's go through the next portion of this
But
agenda
maybe
item.
Twee has a question
Yeah,
about the data.
Well, maybe I should let Paul go first in case it might answer it.
Oh, okay.
Why don't you ask your question and I'll tell you if I answer it.
So I looked at the document where it says 35 total hotels, 20 of which have 150 rooms or less. And then it's not really clear because you did say 9 out of 35 total hotels are distressed. But are those all out of the 20? Are they all 150 rooms or less? That's not clear.
No, I said there are 20 small hotels that are 150 rooms or less. And of those, 7 of the small hotels are distressed.
Okay.
Does that help?
Okay, so then 2 are not small hotels that are
Yeah,
distressed.
yeah, you could say that.
And what is not small hotels? Is that just over
It's
150
over-
rooms
It's over 150 rooms.
with no
It's a
ceiling?
big-
Like,
A big hotel.
okay, so 150.
That number is picked because various proposals have identified that a hotel with 150 rooms or less would be a candidate for conversion. That's where that number comes from.
Okay, and then for offices, do we have anything similar in terms of small offices? Are we talking full floors? Are we talking?
No, at least so far. The proposals might develop with more criteria, but as far as I know, maybe Paul knows the answer. As far as I know, there's not big office buildings and small office buildings, just office buildings.
Yeah, it's a little more vague there because there's twice as many offices than hotels here. That's why.
Well, yeah. I do have to admit that since I did the survey, I have a great appreciation for the number of office buildings in Chelsea, at least where I surveyed, and there are some huge office buildings in Chelsea, which I hadn't noticed them before. You have to look up and you see how high they are.
And I will add to this, in terms of office space, last time we met, we talked about the distinction between Class A, Class B, and Class C office spaces. And then there was a recent article in the New York Times that Mike Noble had circulated to some of us, pointing out the distinction of what they call lease span. So these commercial buildings that have a large distance between the core elevator shaft and the windows of the walls, the larger that distance is, the more challenging it is to convert that to residential. Because if you think about the windows are here and the elevator is here, there's no windows between the living room and there'd be no windows for the bedrooms and to get to the elevators and bathrooms. So large commercial buildings are less prone to be converted to residential because it would be much more effort because you'd have to put in more plumbing and services into the building. So within Chelsea, we did see that there are a certain number, when we were looking at buildings, I know I did when I was out in the field, I looked at a building to see how big the building was. The bigger buildings are less prone to being converted than the smaller buildings. So if you think of those mid-block buildings that are narrow, you think about Soho, Tribeca, those buildings that there's enough distance front to back and the elevator shaft is in the middle, those could be converted more likely. So it's just, that's a very subjective thing. And I think, Twee, as we get into more of the conversation about the city's approach to commercial and the city's approach and the state's approach to conversion, we'll see why we're going through this exercise.
Yeah, thank you. I think that lends itself to parameters that are starting to form.
Right. Bert, you raised your hand. Brad, you want to turn your camera off?
I found that very helpful, Paul. I hadn't thought about that distance from the elevator windows in terms of conversion. Is that, I'm asking, is that a function of age of the buildings? My sense, maybe the older buildings are like that, while the newer ones might not be. Do we have any sense? The buildings in Chelsea tend to be more B than A, older than younger, newer?
I don't have the data to support that. To answer that question, it's more subjective. And if you think about the buildings in the 20s mid-block versus the new buildings by the High Line, right? Those have different construction models. But if you think about, like, look at Manhattan West and those new towers that are going up across from Moynihan. That floor plan with a big core in the center and 45 feet out to the windows, a building like that is not going to be converted. Like, it's just not possible. But if you walk along 22nd Street between like 6th and 8th, there's a lot of buildings in there that look like they could be commercial, but they are residential. So I think the stuff that's built before the 70s would have more prone to be like that.
So I'm the reverse of what the older buildings have less distance from the core elevator to the windows.
I mean, I think that's but I think that tends to be more based on the lot size of what was built in those years, right? So, David?
Yeah, in the old days, tall buildings had smaller footprints, and it wasn't until open office planning became standard in like the 1950s and 60s that they started having these big floor plates with all the distance between the cores and the exterior envelope. And if you look at Lower Manhattan, say from the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, you see the 1920s buildings, they look like needles compared to the newer buildings. So it just has to do with the nature of office space, and those skinnier old buildings successfully do convert to residential, and that's happened with buildings like 70 Pine in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, so, look at the Woolworth building. It's residential now, right?
In general, the newer the office building is, the more it's likely to be bulky and not be a good candidate for adapting to housing.
But so I think this is a good segue into sort of the conversation about what we want to have as our conversation going forward now, is that the city is looking at conversion of surplus space, whether it's hotels or commercial office space, and the state is looking at commercial office space, vacant commercial office space and hotel space due to the pandemic and this glut of open space and our need to address affordable housing and homeless housing issues. So last month, the full board sent a letter saying, if you're going to, we wanted to basically stop the governor from putting money into a budget, the state budget, to acquire properties without community input. And so we basically said in a letter the last time, we want to make sure that we're included in any decisions about siting or locations of these facilities. Many of us are familiar with the debacle that's happened in the 36, 37, 38, 39 blocks when the homeless shelters closed and homeless residents were put into hotels in big clusters, and they were all concentrated, and it caused all kinds of problems for the neighbors, problems for the residents themselves and for the neighbors who lived there. So it was a problematic way to address the homelessness issues. So we as a board have been trying to be proactive in determining how the city will act and how the state will act if they are to acquire distressed properties and convert them into residential use. So what we want to have a conversation about now is what are the proposals and recommendations we would like to make as a community board. Now, Hell's Kitchen Land Use had their meeting last week and went through this proposal document. And what I'd like to do is get input from this committee on what ideas you have and what should be important so that we can, and then the Chelsea Land Use Committee is going to vote on the recommended letter to send to the community board for full approval. All right, so we're going to have a discussion now about these issues. Chelsea Land Use will take the lead on voting on the letter to move forward to the full board. So
I would just like to add something, that Paul is a member.
So if anybody else is having trouble with Betty's connection, Betty, your connection is really funky today. So I think what she's saying is that
Hell's Kitchen,
She's not hearing you.
Hell's Kitchen Land Use.
I'm putting her on. Oh,
yeah, Betty, your internet connection is funky, and every time you speak, it gets wonky. So I think you were announcing that I serve on both the Chelsea Land Use Committee and the Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committees, and I cross over between the two to get a district-wide perspective on the land use issues. And Betty, you're muted now.
Betty, I muted you because your sound is so off. No, you can unmute yourself now. I just was muting you before because your sound was really bad.
Go ahead, Betty.
No, Paul, I guess you're going to get to the fact that in the Dropbox, there's a document that
Yes.
kind of refer to.
Yes, actually, I'm going to ask two things. Jesse, will you share screen the document itself, or you want to give me share screen capability and I'll do it?
I gave you share screen capability.
All right, great. So what I'm going to do, everybody, is bring up the document to go through it because there is a lot of detail. And I'd also like to see, there are members of the public who have joined us from Scott Stringer's office and Brett Hoyleman's office, and there's some Block Association people here as well. So I want to have them be able to see the document that's in the Dropbox in case they hadn't already done it. So can you see the COVID residential conversions policy and recommendations list? If I can see a few heads nod, that'd be great. Okay. So going through, this is where this is in our draft form, what came out of Hell's Kitchen Land Use. And you'll see that the first part of this letter is really the general principles of where we want to go. The general principles really reflect what we sent in last month's letter, so that social service facilities should be distributed throughout all boroughs, not clustered. There should be a transparent process. The acquisition plans should not be solely opportunity-based. Only nonprofits with a proven track record should be considered. We don't support the contribution into offsite locations. Any consideration of acquiring a distressed property in CD4 should take into consideration our affordable housing plan. Twee, you'll like this one. Retrofitting of buildings should provide adequate ventilation and air filtration systems against airborne illnesses. And then we now move into the next part of the conversation. And this is where we want to address some of the issues that we want to push going forward. So there are different categories: homeless shelter conversions, supporting housing conversions, and affordable housing conversions. And everybody remembers from last month, we went through what these different definitions mean. So on this first topic of homeless shelter conversions, we're currently reading that we don't want new shelters to be located in proximity to existing shelters, social service facilities, and other new supportive housing within a certain radius for a total of a certain number of beds within that radius. And that is a direct reaction to what happened in the 30s in the location of the overcrowding. We want shelters in a certain number of range of beds with a goal towards a certain number below, and that all shelters must include required social service support and staff office space and resident common space on site. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions about that category? Particularly taking a look at the radius, like how far apart they should be, the number of beds, and that sort of stuff. So Brad?
Hi, Paul. I would just add service support / and security / staff office space, right? And I would also say on-site. Oh, it does say on-site there. So office space and resident common space on-site. We should say service support on-site and security on-site. Not, oh, we have people come by for an hour once a day.
So I'm hearing two things there. The on-site, which I'm hearing clearly, office space, resident common space on-site, but security is another thing that is not in here right now, and you want to add that in.
Yes,
Okay, thanks.
please. And is 500 feet? That's only a block away.
Yeah. The issue is to think about it about being a block distance, right? Like if you have somebody on 20th between 8th and 9th and somebody on 20th between 7th and 8th, those two shelters are far enough apart that it wouldn't be that clustered.
I mean, I haven't made up my mind on this, Paul, but that's a cluster in my mind. Right now, within a block, you see what's going on at 21st and 8th right now, and you hear all the reports of what's going on by the school and everything. I mean, 500 feet, a half a block, that's nothing. You know, I would say a radius of at least 5 blocks, you know, but I don't know my full opinion on this.
Here,
But if the goal is to separate them and not have them clustered, my suggestion would be it needs to be longer than a block. 500 feet is not enough. That's the congregation. So that's my opinion.
Can you all see the map now that's on the screen?
Yes.
All right, so if you look, Brad, this, where I'm circling now is the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, between 6th and 8th, right? You can see here where it says 24 and 16, that yellow is a shelter, and this hotel is a under 150 room hotel. So it would make sense not to have a shelter at that hotel adjacent to that shelter, right? Whereas if you look over here, this block, this whole stretch, there is no homeless shelter. This is a hotel that is under 150 rooms. So perhaps this one might make sense. So I think it's a matter of looking at the various blocks. This block on 26, here's a big shelter. We don't want one here. And if we scroll up now, look at what's going on up here. This is the trouble area, right? This is why we're going through this exercise. It's because they have all these shelters that have been converted next to hotels and COVID release centers and services. So this is what we want to avoid. But this,
I think that's even more to my point, Paul, because then it's, you know, we also can't predict which ones. This is an incredible job by the committee to put this together, but it's surely not the entire plan out there. And, you know, in my opinion, I think one block, 500 feet is not enough. That is not enough. That's all I'll say.
I'll make note, and then I'll make note of that, Brad, and then we'll get input from some others too on that. But definitely the security on site is a great contribution. So thank you. And
Paul, I also would say staff on site, not an office that the staff visits. It's staff on site. But I think maybe we want to have.
Okay, thanks. Pam, I think you were next.
I think so. I was going to comment on the same thing, the 500-foot radius. I think Brad is on the mark there. I think it needs to be a greater distance. One, if I'm understanding it right, it's one that allows more than one facility on a given block. If there's one at each end of the block, for example, that's if that doesn't seem appropriate to me. I think it's a point well taken.
So one of the discussions we had at Hell's Kitchen Land Use was whether we define it as a foot radius or a block radius. And then we added in this total of a certain number of beds within the radius. So it's not just the distance, but it's also the concentration.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
All
But
right.
you're
Well,
you're
I
also
just-
voicing you'd like a little greater,
I'd like a little better spacing, yes.
little more spacing.
Whether it's in linear feet or radius or just block by block.
Okay. Marty?
I may be asking the same question and looking at the other side of the coin. I see the number of 150 beds within that radius. I'm not making a statement. I'm really seriously asking a question for my own brain. What is the number 150? What does it mean? How do you arrive at it?
That's the number of beds. You'll see that in this next line, the new shelters between 50 to 100 beds with a preference to lower sized shelters. So it's the number of places the residents can put their heads. Is that it?
I understand that the number means beds or heads, people, but I don't understand how you arrived at 150.
I can't answer that question. I don't know. It came out of conversations from Hell's Kitchen and with Joe Restuccia. I mean, that's like people who have been doing more with the housing and homeless situation and less with the land use planning portion. And we have some other members in the public that might be able to help us address that. So when I open up to the public, I'll try to ask if anybody knows that as well. Or if anybody else on the committee knows the answer, we can share.
So is it a question that you think we should be pursuing?
It's a question. I think that the number 150 came up out of people with more knowledge on this than me, and they presented that number. I don't have the answer to you as to why that number is 150.
Paul?
Yes, Jesse.
One of the reasons, and I'm sure I could be corrected, but my understanding is that was the number that was selected right from when the initial idea of this came from the state. They were using, that was the cutoff, right? For
That's a good point. The size of the hotel, they consider large and small, the 150 number.
Right.
So that Marty, that might be where that number came from, is the state's determination of what is a hotel that is small enough to be acquired is 150 rooms or less.
yes.
So that, yeah, thanks, Jesse. That probably does clarify that. Carrie? Oh, I'm sorry. No, Mike was before Carrie. Mike first. Mike Noble?
Yep. Just getting to the mute button. No, everybody's just covered it all. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks. Carrie?
I just had a question, and it may not be an issue if we have, social services, staff, security, et cetera, on site. But what about the large amount of schools in Chelsea? And is there a radius, from a school that's necessary based on some of the stuff we've been dealing with, in Hell's Kitchen?
It's a great question. I don't have an opinion on that. So, but let's talk more about it. All right. Let's move on to this next category. Pam, your hand is still up. I assume that.
No, I took my hand down and I put it back up. I wanted
okay.
to add to that conversation, if I
Great.
may.
Yeah.
Just to remind everyone, BRC on 25th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues is a 328 bed facility. When we were discussing in the community and also at CB4, when they were putting BRC together, we tried for 150 beds to be max. And I don't know if that has anything to do with the origin of this number, but that's what we were aiming for. And we missed by a country mile because the Department of Homeless Services overruled everything. But just so you know, that facility is a whopper.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Pam. Tina, your hand came up.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the BRC. With Pam, I was a part of the advisory committee for quite a few years, and they actually our bedroom looks into their bedrooms. And one of the things we should keep in mind is the BRC, I'll give you my example here, is not supposed to be housing sex offenders. And I found out that in fact they were, and the sex offenders are ranked according to the degree of their crime. I think it's 1 through 3. And you can go online and find out. And it appeared that BRC was not on top of the situation, and we got them to change that. So for situations where accommodations might be near schools, this is something I think we should definitely put into a letter. I think that's extremely important.
That's excellent, Tina. Thanks. That does bring a good perspective there. And it helps address Carrie's concern about proximity to schools. That's great. All right, let's move on to supportive housing conversions. You'll see a lot of this language sort of repeats, right? That no supportive housing should be within a certain radius with a certain number of beds. They should be no more than the same size. They must require it. And again, Brad, I think you're right, add in on-site social support staff, on-site staff office space, and resident common space. We'll just distinguish that list. Now we get into some of the other issues. The model for new supportive housing conversions, the city's model for supportive housing typically includes 60% homeless and 40% community. That's a city formula. And so we were thinking just to continue to support that formula. We want to point out that new supportive housing should not only be for single individuals, but we do have a need for family supportive housing programs in the district. And so we want to make sure that that's a component of the consideration. And that we prefer that supportive housing should be a component of a larger affordable housing development and not just a single building of 100% supportive housing. So any thoughts or questions on Bert?
Yeah, I'm just questioning the 60%, 40%. You say it's city policy. Is there any, it's a weird question, a homeless person who would say be eligible to live in supportive housing, how would that person be distinguished from a homeless person living in a shelter? Is there some kind of criteria of one from the other?
I think that is in.
Is there a medical component to it?
I think that comes up in the next section on this next section on affordable housing conversions. If you'll see in this last bullet, the third to last bullet, reserved for referrals. So there is a distinction between someone who's homeless and in a shelter versus someone who is coming out of the shelter system and going into their own supportive housing where they have their own apartment, so to speak. So think of it as they're moving out of a shelter where they rotate through the days to their own apartment with supportive housing in it. And that I think is the distinction, Bert.
Okay, and also this raises another question. We're just talking homeless. Do we want to distinguish between, I think we might want to distinguish between homeless individuals and homeless families.
Yes, and that certainly in this, that's this last bullet here that, I'm sorry, not the second to last bullet, that we want family households as well. So yes, that's in there.
Okay, going back to the shelter conversions, are all those shelter conversions for individuals or are they also for families? Do we know? Do we want to make a statement about that?
I think that's a good point. Let's add it in.
I mean, I don't know what kind of statement we want to make, but I think we should be aware and include that.
Great. Yep, I'll add that back up to the other point. Thanks, Bert. Tweed?
Yes, hi. Could you please explain a little bit further the large affordable housing development? Because we're saying in this supportive housing conversion, no more than 50 to 100 rooms. So if it's a part of a large affordable development, that means that development has to have 200 rooms, of which this might be half, or 400 rooms, of which this might be 1/4. That's what I'm trying to understand.
I'm not following where the question's coming from, too. What are you
It's
reading?
coming from supportive housing conversions, last bullet. So preferably supportive housing should be a component of a larger affordable housing development, not on its own. Meaning the supportive housing, if it has no more than 5,200 rooms, which is the second bullet point, then it's not just 100 rooms of a standalone building. That's not what we want. It sounds like we want.
No, I'm not. Where are you getting 5,200 rooms? I'm not seeing that.
Second bullet point.
New supportive housing should have no more than 5,200. 52.
52,
No,
100.
50-2. 50 up
Right.
to 100. It's not 50, not 5,100 rooms.
I understand that. I'm reading it fast. So I'm reading what you're reading, 50 or up to 100 rooms. But if you
Okay.
combine that with the last bullet point, it reads to me that it would be, if it's part of a larger development, that development might be 200 rooms, of which this might be up to 1/2, which is 100 rooms. Or if that development is 400 rooms, that this might be up to 25% of that for the 100 rooms max. Is that how your plan, is that what you're trying to convey?
I think that the way this is thought through, and if it's not clear by the way it's written, we might have to rewrite it, is that even in a larger development, that let's say a large development has 500 rooms, there would still be a maximum of 100 rooms as supportive housing.
Paul, I think this, I saw this bullet. It seems kind of confusing, that last bullet. Preferably supportive housing. Can you hear me or am I wacky?
Yes, no, that's good. Go, Betty.
Should be a component of a larger affordable housing development, not on its own. That is kind of confusing.
On its own.
Jesse?
For example, just as a point of reference is like what's going to be a project that the other land use committee has been working on, and it's going to be certified hopefully for next month, is the slaughterhouse site, which has 300 plus 300 units, 350 units, I believe, somewhere in that range, and 100 of those, or 75 to 100 of those, will be supportive housing. The rest will be regular standard affordable housing. So I think that's what, like, that concept is what I think, not those numbers specifically, but that concept is what we're talking about.
You know what, maybe, thank you, Jesse, that was a good point. Maybe rather than using the word development, be a component of a larger affordable housing building. Because when I think of developments, I think of Penn South and NYCHA, and, complexes. You know what I'm saying, Jesse?
Yeah, so you're saying change the word to a large affordable housing building, not its own separate building, like distinguished, not on its own. Does that clarify for you, Twee, as well?
I think that would be helpful.
Yes, I believe, Paul, you did answer my question with the example of it's a 500 unit building. And so the 100 rooms would be supportive housing. And similarly with the slaughterhouse example, if it's 350 units, approximately 75 to 100 is supportive housing. That's what I get when I combine the second bullet point with the last bullet point.
Okay. All right. David?
Do you want to say something about that housing, going back to that last bullet point, being integrated with the affordable housing as opposed to a kind of a pour door situation?
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, thank you, David. All right, Twee and David's hands are still up, but I assume you've done. So let's move on to the next section. So now affordable housing conversions to reinforce economic diversity. We want to have a full range of AMIs where there is density of social services of supporting housing. Conversions should only, if there already is a density of social services or supportive housing on a block or within that radius that we're still trying to navigate, the conversion should only focus on new affordable housing, which would mean it would not include supportive housing. right? Just so I just want to make sure, after our past conversation, I just want to make sure everybody understands that distinction. This number, 15% of new affordable housing must be reserved for referrals, homeless households or individuals. That 15%, now keeping in mind, we're talking about affordable housing, not supportive housing, right? The city has now a practice of putting in 15% of new affordable must be what they call the referrals, homeless households or individuals. And that goes to Bert's point about the distinction between someone who's homeless or someone who's moving into housing. And they want all of new affordable developments to be at that 15%, which is at the lowest AMI. Is that clear to everybody? Is that making sense? And then to talk about any affordable units have a HPD lottery is 50% for District 4, and that they should make sure to help navigate the lottery. Hector? Hector, you're muted.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry about that. I would like to find out if we could mention something about specifically about, because there is an issue within NYCHA where some homeless people are actually just being taken off the street and they have priority apparently to get an apartment in NYCHA because there's a prevalent amount of studios available. Now, I don't have an issue with that, but the problem I have is there are no social services set up properly for that kind of transition to take them from the street into housing like that. I mean, we have a prevalent issue with youth, unfortunately, that you know, they are put into where they age out of some of these programs when they turn 18, and automatically they are forced to either, hey, you're out of here, find another accommodation, or they are put as a priority on in housing in NYCHA. And unfortunately, that NYCHA itself is not geared to handle that sort of to handle the social aspects that are required of individuals that need extra assistance, especially for a transition for something like that, either from the street or when they age out of a program. So I'm afraid that this is going to continue to become a prevalent issue and get worse, unfortunately.
I think there are two issues there, Hector, from what I'm hearing. One is NYCHA is not addressing the issue as it should. And second is the way we're trying to tackle it is specifically responsive to what you're raising here, right? If you look at this bullet here, it talks about social service funding or social service support must accompany the requirement. So any conversions to affordable housing would have that requirement in it that you're pointing out as a problem at NYCHA that doesn't exist, right? So I think that it's a separate issue for NYCHA than it is. And what we're doing is reacting. I think this letter is saying what you're saying, that it shouldn't be going on in other sites, and that we want to make sure that it doesn't. Does that make sense?
But yeah, it does. But can you also mention that in NYCHA that basically this letter should be in support of programs in NYCHA as well? Because I think what ends up happening is NYCHA is sometimes gets treated as a separate entity, like nobody knows how to deal with it. And basically NYCHA supposedly falls under some different purview. And that's been an issue for many years here. Yeah. So if it could be mentioned specifically in addition to everything else, that'd be great.
Let me think through that a little bit, Hector, because I think NYCHA, my thought is that the NYCHA issue should go to HHHS and have them deal with the NYCHA problems that exist rather than having the land use committee try to fix an existing problem at NYCHA. Is that, I'm not trying to deflect, but I'm deflecting.
I get that. It's just that unfortunately I have a feeling that it'll get deflected back and it'll go back and forth and nothing will get accomplished. You know,
maybe
I'm not saying
maybe we add a clause in here, like based on the poor experience at NYCHA or something like that, just to point out the issue without trying to tackle it on this topic. So
no, I get that. I know, and it's a much larger issue. I mean, you know, on a different scale, obviously.
I appreciate it. Yeah, Jesse.
I mean,
Jesse.
Hector, we should let's circle back on that with Maria and Joe about and bring that to get that on housing's radar, because I think I think that'd be news to a lot of people, and I think more we learn about it, the more the committee could be effective on it. So
Okay.
let's talk
Thank you.
tomorrow about it, and let's get it on the Maria's and Joe's radar.
Yeah, I think that is a great idea. And I actually, Hector, I didn't know all those meetings I sat through in the working group. I don't remember this thing that you're talking about being raised. So I think it's excellent for the housing committee.
Great. I think Mike was next and then Bert. Mike Noble.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Hector said. It's not a matter of some social service, but specific social services that address the needs of these particular people. So when we see them moving into the NYCHA developments here, there's absolutely nothing for them. These young kids, I see, social workers having to come from the city or ACS or whatever constantly because there's nobody around to deal with them on a day-to-day basis close to home.
And I think Mike, that's I'm going to echo what I just said to Hector in that.
Yeah, I know.
We're trying to avoid that from happening in future conversions. So
exactly.
Let's take that to HHS. Bert and then Brad.
In any event, Paul, put a word between referrals and homeless in line 86.
I'm sorry, what?
Or something. The grammar of line 86 is a bit off, right?
Yeah, I think it just should be referral homeless household, not referrals plural.
For the referral of homeless households.
Yeah.
For the referral of homeless.
There is some
referral of
homeless.
Yeah, for the referral of homeless households or individuals.
Gotta just put an OF in there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Right. Okay.
Bert and then Brad.
Yeah, I just want to raise, I know we've always talked about 50% for residents of the community district. And as I'm raising it, I'm also arguing with myself.
Why don't you finish your argument? We'll get Brad to contribute, and then we'll come back to you once you're resolved.
No, I'm not resolved at all. I'll let the committee resolve it. I'd like to see 50% reserved for residents or people working in the community district. As long as they meet the income requirements, blah, blah, blah.
I don't agree.
I didn't expect you to agree.
All right, let's go to Brad, and then I'm going to come back to Twee, and I think I saw Mike's hand go back up again, so he may have a thought on that. Brad?
Yeah, Paul and Betty, I'm just wondering, is this a point where we could kind of say in this letter it's on kind of what Bert's saying, on what we prefer and just instead of numbers? So I would prefer the transitional housing to be 100% family, right? Our district has a lot of single homeless spots. And maybe and with the great schools we have here, and I remember I was heartbroken when these families get moved all over and the kids, they don't have money to clean the clothes. Stuff like that is just tragic. And maybe we could ask that we prefer in our district that if you're going to do this type of housing, that it's going to be it's going to be a family oriented one. Also, can we say, hey, we've got a lot of veterans on the street. Can this one be a VA homeless shelter with all the VA services in it? We've got what we have on the west side. We have a big tradition of the military here in the district, and maybe we should ask for housing to help them here and not just somebody from the Bronx that's going to be put here. I'm just throwing it out to the committee. If we're writing letters of how we want this converted, maybe we should think about some specifics, really specific items that could be added to this. I mean, it's a want. It's not like they're going to listen, but it's just something I thought maybe we could discuss.
Let's go.
And also, one more thing, and then I'll turn it over back to you, Paul, is maybe we should make another note that when these buildings are converted and have that commercial or retail on the first floor, that we get a type of medical clinic within a radius, because we need it. So not only do they need the mental help, but they really do need physical help, especially now with vaccines and the rest. And if we're going to have a converted building, the bottom should have a medical space for it.
Yeah, I have a reaction to that, but I'm going to let some others go. Twee and then Hector.
I'll go with what I originally was going to say, and then I want to react to Bert first. As soon as I hear someone who, if this is opening up to someone who works here, that to me just screams pied à terre. Someone who has a house outside and then wants to live and work in the same place and then have somewhere else. And if you open it up to that qualification. But I was really surprised. I mean, generally AMI, when I'm looking at these charts for affordable housing, they are area median income, but they seem to be somewhat imaginary numbers. I think I came to New York City taught that your rent had to be 30% of your income. And looking at one person making $131,000 with a studio of $2,700, that's only 25% of that person's income. I just did the calculator thing. So anything above 100% AMI seems not really geared towards affordability.
When others who have done this longer than me can tell you, Twee, that when they rent for an AMI, the AMI rent is pegged to that number as well, so it shifts. So your if you're at an income level of a certain AMI, your AMI rent is adjusted to 30% of. So the studios don't rent at the same number. They're pegged to the AMI rates.
Okay.
I can send you a matrix for that, Twee, at some point, because it's nice to have. It's very illuminating.
Yeah.
Reassuring.
Matrix sounds nice.
Matrix, I love those words. All right.
But there was something I saw, maybe it was in the other letter, Paul, and I don't mean to jump if it were. The idea of having equal in terms of the AMI, do I remember that correctly?
Equal
that like the number of affordable and the number of homeless and the number of supportive, they all need to be equally represented in the building. Did I remember that correctly?
They're not always equal. One of the things that we have fought for, and Bert can attest to this because he's been, we've been fighting this for the community board level for a long time, is that we don't have holes in the income bands. So that if we have AMIs of 0 to 50, we don't then jump up to 125 to 165. So somebody earning just over the 50% AMI level is excluded from the building, while we still have people so we try to avoid those holes. But the number of it's not often an equal percentage that we say there's a percentage of 50 and a percentage of 60 and a percentage of 80. Those are driven a lot by the city and what their needs are, which is why we're seeing more of a demand for that 15% of the recent transition referral from homeless, is because there's a higher demand for that now than there had been in the past. And so we're seeing those lower AMI bands going into more of these affordable housing conversion complexes because of that.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I thank you for the explanation of holes. It's just even the 125 to 165 in terms of range of incomes, that to me just, it looks like market rate, at those levels.
Yes, and you can go to the housing committee for that one too.
Fair enough, thank you.
Hector?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Brad's comment about the veteran inclusiveness in some of this. Yeah, I think it'd be phenomenal if we could include that, or basically highlight that as well, because there are organizations like the New York City Veterans Alliance and the Black Veterans Alliance that specialize in things like that. So maybe at a later date we can have them present at a community board for a meeting, out of scope of what we're doing here. But yeah, I think groups like that need special attention when it comes to plants of this scope. Okay,
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that mention.
Thank you, Hector. Brad, did your hand go back up or was it not taken down?
Sorry, I'll take it down, Paul.
Okay, no, I didn't want to miss you. That's all. I wasn't sure if you wanted to come back in. So, Brad, I do want to address that issue you raised about the preference for more family and VA, about retail space. It kind of goes back to an argument on the 15% should be afforded. One of the things that we have to be cognizant of is the city is, thinking about going ahead and acquiring distressed properties and converting them into housing stock. And what we're trying to do is say to the city, don't do it without us and make sure that you follow our recommendations. So the more recommendations we put in, it'll seem the harder it is that we are to work with, and they may just ignore us and go ahead and do what they want to do, which could be catastrophic. So I want to find a way to balance that a little bit. So I like these ideas, and I want to see if there's a way that we can weave that into the conversation, but not be emphatic in the stance on that. Does that?
So, Paul, I would leave the politics to you, but I would say that where we write in, if you scroll further up where it says non-for-profit homeless operations and affordable housing operations, we should say veterans, because we would maybe say we prefer like we have down here at the old jail, right? And that used to house sailors, right? So is that a good spot for a VA possibility? I would just like to maybe we could add it that way in, Paul. Yeah. And then I would say, besides having services in-house, that within some of these radiuses, one or two of the shelters have a medical facility that could help service. And then I would say we prefer family. But I'll let you handle how you want to write it, or if you do or not. But I just think these are things that are an ask. I fought for years with the transportation committee and the chair regarding buses to be electric. And I was told over and over and over again, we don't want to push them too hard. We don't want to push them too hard. I'm just not buying it. And that's not usually how our board works, but I will leave it to you and Joe on how to maybe finesse that.
Yeah, I think there is, I agree, Brad. There's a way that we need to weave it in. And I do think we'll find a way. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands for committee discussion. So I'd like to open it up to any members of the public who might want to bring some comments in, and then I'll come back to the committee for a vote. So Jesse, are there any members of the public who have raised their hand who want to speak, or any members of the public?
We have two, Brian Weber and John Chalice. I can bring them both over if that's what you like.
Perfect, thank you.
Give me one moment. Brian, are you there?
I see John Chalice. So John, Brian, I'm gonna go with John first. John, okay. If you can tell us your name, where you're from, and if you wouldn't mind sharing your camera, that would be helpful. But if not, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that if I can learn how to do it quickly.
Paul,
could we go back to full screen?
Yeah, do you mind stop sharing?
Oh, yeah. I left it there in case members of the public wanted to comment there. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead, John.
So my name is John Chalice. I live on 36th Street, so I'm not in Chelsea, but I'm in Hell's Kitchen, and I'm deeply interested in this for reasons I don't even need to go into. Just a couple of thoughts. Thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation listening to this, and a lot of work's gone into this. Just a comment on the 500 feet. If you do the math, you could, within a square mile, end up with 100 shelters that still didn't violate that rule. It does two on one block, which is what we had here, albeit they were right across the street from each other. That's not a practical distancing from the point of view of densifying or kind of spreading this out. And if the goal here is to have kind of this sort of across the 5 boroughs, I think you can make a sort of a reasonable rule about what a sensible density for Chelsea might be, and it would be broader than 500 feet.
What would be, John, what would be your suggestion?
Well, even
Thanks, Betty.
even if you went with 1,000, which is kind of the next obvious increment, that's 4 short blocks or 1 long block. You want to think about it that way. That still feels pretty tight. I think, frankly, if it were I and I were kind of getting started, I'd probably go in with at least 1,500 feet, probably 2,000 as a starting point. This isn't going to add to your list of requirements, but what it will, I mean, the difficulty will be for Hell's Kitchen, where we just have many more hotels than you do. There, the city might choose to ignore it because it's going to make their job harder. They're just going to find more distressed properties in North and Midtown, further north from Chelsea. But and I know this is to be a joint letter, or at least I understand it's to be a joint letter, so that might not be practical, but it certainly, I think, would be more desirable.
Thank you for your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Secondly, sex offender registration, that's really important. I sat on a call with the 3 shelter providers on the street. I asked specifically about that because we have a bunch of kids in our building. The shelter providers, the DHS actually, and one of the shelter providers said something along the lines of, it's up to the residents to notify the sex offender registry when they move. That's not our problem, basically. I think we need to make it clear that that is, in fact, the responsibility of the shelter provider. I don't think we can rely on people to identify themselves. And it's going to be important if these guys are going to become established parts of the community. And if they want to be in the community permanently, and we'd like to welcome them, we need to understand if you're, especially if they are going to be close to the school. And I don't know if schools were on your map, but if it's not on the map, it might be something.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, John. It's not, and medical facilities and schools are not mapped out right now. And I think that as Kerry raised, it's an important component we'll have to add in.
Right.
So thank you.
Those were my material points. So again, thank you for letting me join in.
Thanks, John. Brian?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great.
If you're in the mood to share camera, it'd be great, but otherwise.
You know what, we don't seem to have that option. We can just share volume. Right. So otherwise okay. I would make an appearance.
Okay, that's fine, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Brian Weber. I'm a public member on community board for Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committee. I'm also
Whoops, we lost Brian. Brian?
There you are.
Hey, okay. That just shifted. All right, I was just saying who I was. I think you all know me by now. I was just going to echo John's sentiment, and I think Brad raised it and several other board members raised it. 500, 150 rooms is way too dense. The 150 rooms is somewhat arbitrary. It originally came out of the budget, as Jesse said, but I think they had come up with that number thinking that it wouldn't conflict with a lot of union-owned hotels throughout the city, or not union-owned, union-operated hotels. So they were thinking smaller hotels, and that's where that 150 number came from. For context, even when the temporary shelters move off of West 36th Street, we will still have a 100-bed facility, which is a permanent facility that's been here pre-pandemic and will be here post-pandemic. And to put another facility within 500 feet of that would be a disservice to the existing facility and any other facility put in. So I don't know how, since the Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committee, we got to a number of 500 feet. But I think that we're asking for significant problems, maybe not as much in Chelsea, but certainly in the West 30s and certainly in Upper Hell's Kitchen. So I think, I don't know if that's something that needs to be
I think that, Brian, as I recall from Hell's Kitchen Land Use meeting, that number 500 was basically, it's a block.
Right, but
So
I don't think
they didn't want more than one on a block.
right. I don't think we even got there. I don't remember that number coming out of that meeting. I think it was like we were all scratching our head and hoping that Chelsea would come up with a better number. So because quite frankly, you know, just again, 36th Street, we have a 100-bed shelter on our street. On 35th Street, we have a methadone clinic. And on 37th Street, we have a needle exchange. And it's kind of a perfect storm between all those entities. And so,
I think that's why they didn't do the block, is because the foot radius would preclude that from happening. You wouldn't, because the distance this way is in this way, you wouldn't be running into that. All right, thanks, Brian.
Right. Okay, thank you.
All right, and Jesse, did I see Julia's hand up too?
Yeah, I can bring her over.
Thanks. Hi, Julia. The floor is yours if you want to unmute.
There we go. Hi. Yeah, there we go.
There you go.
Actually, John and Brian have said what I was thinking. The 500-foot radius is it's too close. It's two vertical blocks. It's one horizontal block. It would provide the density. It would just create the same problems that we've already been experiencing in the West 30s. Also, the proximity to schools is very important, as it's been, as we've seen in this community in Hell's Kitchen. There exists substance abuse residents of these shelters, and a byproduct of that is drug paraphernalia all over the streets. So if it were near a school, I think it would create another problem. And when you're in the West 30s, I know this isn't the topic, but bear in mind that there's a huge street homeless population that already exists there. I don't know if that can be taken into consideration when they're deciding what buildings near Penn Station or Port Authority, if they should be converted. So that was it.
Thanks, Julia.
Julia's the president of her block association.
Yes.
I should have been in the meeting last week, but I missed it. So
thank you, Julia.
thought there might be some overlap.
And Jesse, I now see another hand in the participant search.
I will bring Serge over.
Thank you. Sir Tarnett, if you want to unmute, can you tell us who you are? And
yeah, sure. I'm just unmuting myself and starting video.
Perfect.
You know, Brian really speaks for so many people. And I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, what Julia said is that he really said everything I wanted to say. What I think you have to understand is that there are so many people who are feeling the same thing here. This is a terrible situation. It's a sad situation. And one of the problems, and I'm not sure if your letter addresses this, but a lot of these cookie cutter hotels do not have the facility to provide any services. Really, they were designed for people to go to Broadway and just sleep and leave. Nobody hangs out at these hotels. And these hotels are now the chosen place for so many people who are in distress. And I just wanted to, you know, give Brian a shout out and say thank you. And I'm sorry I'm so dark here with the light. You know what's going on.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
And just to specifically address that, yes, I think that the reason we've added in on-site common space is for that, what you're talking about. I think you've touched on a very important point, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other public hands up, so we'll come back to committee. Thank you to the public members who have spoken. Appreciate your input. We're going to go back now to committee discussion and then formulate a vote. So I'm going to go Brad, then Kit, then Marty. Brad?
Yeah, just a clarification. The existing hotels that are being used, is that we're saying that those are also have to commit to what we're asking for? Because those are obviously quick targets, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're hitting on the politics of it, Brad. Thanks.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's a part of the that's a layer of the complication here. Yes. Kit?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I've been just trying to listen and learn before commenting here, and just wanted to quickly comment and at least two questions. I agree with what's been said about the importance of making sure that these sites are sufficiently far away from schools, since there seems to be insufficient work done to prevent sex offenders from being located in them. And also agree with the concerns that have been raised about 500 feet probably not being enough distance. I was wondering, Paul, was there a point in time where the folks who put this letter together, or a subgroup from our board, took a look at what's been tried in other places that's shown positive results in these types of conversions?
I don't know of any. Jesse might know of some, but I don't know that we've ever had a global pandemic with a glut of open office space in hotels. So
I'm sure we haven't had that. I guess my question is there someplace else that's had success converting underutilized spaces, specifically hotels, in order to house folks who need it? My hunch is the answer to that question could easily be yes.
Yeah, I don't. Jesse, do you know of any?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head. I will say, I think we were coming from this. I think the board was coming from this not from that sort of perspective yet. I think we were coming from the perspective that the governor attempted to put this into the budget, and then there's a series of pieces of legislations that are going through, different phases. And so I think we wanted us to get ahead of it in terms of just the land use zoning component of it. I think a lot of things that have been raised tonight are all very valid, kind of almost more of the operational component of it. And I think that is something that maybe Paul and Betty and we'll need to sort of think about in terms of the next step, because I do agree we've certainly have examples of good operators and bad operators, and good tactics and bad tactics to use in our district alone. But I'm sure there's examples of when we get to the next stage of, okay, now we're saying this location here is better than that location, and they're going to go ahead and say, okay, let's do this location. Then we're talking about like using those those examples from other cities or other countries that have done it better and how to do it. Yeah,
that's helpful. And the question is not coming from a place of criticizing what's in the letter or the work that's been done. I think what we have makes sense, and I appreciate that we were trying to move quickly because we wanted to have our perspective be considered by the powers that be. I wonder, though, if we want to include something about there being value in researching. Are there ways that have been tried of doing this that have shown positive results? The thing that sort of set me on this path was seeing New York City model and wondering, when was that developed? How much success has it had? I mean, from what I've read and what I know, homelessness has just continued to grow in New York City since at least the Great Recession and its onset. And so I don't know that we are, the paradigm of excellence in this area, and therefore we probably don't have the best approaches to solving these problems. So, would encourage us to think about, are we in this letter at some point in the future saying, after we get this initial stance out there, we want to research and we want the city and the state to research what are the best practices in this area, which also just brings me to another wondering, which is, there's a lot of variables here. Space is finite. Unfortunately, we're not going to come up with perfect solutions. I think it makes sense that we've sort of come up with a binary approach where we're saying this is what will be inbounds, this is what will be out of bounds, and these are the criteria for when you're converting a site. But I also wonder if, at a future stage, we would want to come up with some way that we're sort of scoring these possible sites to say, like, from least desirable to most desirable of the possibilities that meet our criteria, these are the sites in our district, so that we have like a stance on, these are the ones that are far enough apart, far enough away from schools, close enough to medical facilities, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a tension with that. And one of the things you said, Paul, which was we want our recommendations to be implementable by the agencies who are going to be responsible for them. So we can't ask for too much, but it just seems like perhaps we could get a bit more sophisticated in the future in the next iteration of this and say, of all the places that are good enough, these are, the ones that are the most preferred to least preferred, if that makes sense.
That makes great sense, Kit. And I think that's part of the reason why we did this mapping exercise, is to have that scoring facility. So Marty, you're up. And then Marty, then Brad, then Mike. Marty?
Thanks, Paul.
Oh, and hold on, Marty, before you start, can I just ask everybody to start thinking about the one unanswered question I would like to tackle is the distance issue. So if people have thoughts on that. So go ahead, Marty.
Actually, that's one of the things I want to mention. I appreciate Kit's comments just now. I think they cover a range of things that you might want to include. More research for best practices is a part of what he said that really hit me, that might be included somewhere in the letter. Somebody mentioned that there should be attention paid to sex registries. I think background awareness, so that I'm not saying that that's necessarily exclusionary, but it certainly should be something that's done so that social services can perform better and should be aware of. I want to raise my voice in favor of the comments that said schools need to be included in the distancing, and the issue of distancing. Where did the 500 feet come from? Was that from the liquor stuff? I mean, we've had 500 feet on our, and I agree with those folks that have said that 500 feet is insufficient. The original grid for New York City, David may correct me on this, but I think the original grid for New York City was 800 feet blocks, not 500 feet. And I know that there's a lot of variance of that number in our neighborhood, but 500 feet is inadequate for the kinds of things that we want to accomplish. And I know, Paul, you've made the note, but I just wanted you to hear me affirm that 500 feet is insufficient.
Yeah, and again, that 500 feet, I think, came from the notion of a block distance is approximately 500 feet. But if you do it, if you say not on one block, then the point that Brian Weber just raised with us, that you could have something on 35th, something on 36th, something on 37th, all within the same avenue block of each other, and that becomes problematic. So again, it's the question I'd like to get more discussion on is the distance and the resolution. Brad, you're next.
Both of what you said, both the distance number and not on the same block. I mean, if the distance number permits two on the same block, that shouldn't be permitted.
Okay, good point.
It shouldn't be necessarily back to back on a different block. So you also need a distancing requirement. You need them both.
Yeah, okay. Brad?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Kit there. So prior to the pandemic, there were developers all over the city, just not in Midtown and Hell's Kitchen, that were building hotels, and they were purely built to house the homeless because they got big money from the city to put them in there. So it's definitely been a practice that the city is very comfortable with, and it allowed them a lot of flexibility. So all over the city, these hotels were going up, and it was every night 95%, 99% occupancy, and 85% was homeless. So there was a big, and it's still out there. So I mean, in the city's mind, they've done this before. Now they're just gonna take these off their hands, give the loan to the nonprofit, and add more to the system. So I just wanted to respond to that. Not saying it was right, and those places had problems because they don't have the facilities.
Can I respond really quickly to that, Paul?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
That's helpful, Brad. It actually makes me feel more strongly about what I said. It's a data point that shows we didn't really know what we were doing. It wasn't really working very well. It was very lucrative for some developers, but it didn't seem to actually solve the challenges that the city, and most importantly, the folks who are homeless are experiencing. And so I would think we would be missing something if we just said, let's keep on doing things based on our local knowledge.
Oh, yeah, I think Bob bringing it up to say that it wasn't working. So your point of studying the core of why we're having the problem is I agree with. I also think we need to be looking to the waterfront too. Let's not forget that, Paul.
Put them all on boats, Brad, and we'll have everything delivered to them by drone. Mike?
Yeah, Marty's right. You know, cross town down here is 800 feet. Just to get that in. But there's an article that I tried to put in the chat, but we don't have a chat here, right?
No, we don't have chat.
Yeah, well, the article is
Most people
entitled.
from discussion.
Yeah, here's the title in the Times, I guess yesterday. One way to get people off the streets: buy hotels. And in this long article, very heartwarming article about these people who found, homes to live after living in a community of like over 100,000 people. San Francisco, 113,000 people, something like that, right? And they finally got homes after years and years living on the streets in tents. So can I put it in the Q&A? Where can I put this link?
Yes, Mike, you can put it in the Q&A. That'd be perfect.
All right, let's see if it works.
Thanks, Mike. Bert?
Let's see.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw out something that I'm probably the only one here. Don't all jump on me, please. I'm a little uncomfortable with the emphasis on sex offenders. There's an issue here. If a sex offender moved in next door to you, you wouldn't know unless you looked up, okay? They don't have to notify you that they're next door. A sex offender has to register at the someplace downtown every 90 days. I don't know if all levels, but some levels do. I'm just a little uncomfortable because we're not asking these social service agencies that are going to be on site to give us a list of all the bipolar people or all the schizophrenics that might have to all of a sudden have an explosion in front of the school. There's an issue here. I can't quite put my finger on it or my hand around it. There's just something that makes me feel a little uncomfortable about it in terms of civil liberties or.
Yeah, I saw Carrie's hand pop up as soon. I saw Carrie's hand pop up as soon as you said that. So I'm going to bring her back into that part of the dialogue.
Just really quickly, when I brought up the schools, honestly, I wasn't even thinking about that issue. I was thinking more about what we've heard from a lot of the folks on the call tonight about drug use and violence. And I went out and did part of this survey and walked by so many schools and thought, my God, we have so many schools. And I didn't even think about bringing it up to the team, until tonight. So I was just thinking that when we come up with our area of, whatever the distance is, that we should probably take into account the fact that Chelsea has, in the few blocks that I did myself, at least 10 schools. So for the reasons that have been mentioned by a lot of the folks who come to us, from the West 30s and discuss what's happening on their blocks, that we need to think about that. That's all. I agree with you, Bert, in a way. I don't know if we should say this issue or this issue or this issue. That's all. Thank you.
Mike?
Oh, yeah, the Q&A is only open to participants and hosts, and apparently
All right.
I'm not.
So why don't you send it to Jesse and he can circulate it to the committee members. We can read it later.
All right.
Thank you. All right. So Pam.
Hi. So I just wanted to remind everyone that we in Chelsea lived with the Allerton Hotel for many years as a homeless shelter. There was no support system within the hotel at that time. Throughout that entire time, the city supported it and paid vast amounts of money to house homeless in that facility. The impact that it had far exceeded the reach that's being described here, the 500-foot reach. The radius was huge and included PS 11, of course, which was a block away, and all up and down the 8th Avenue corridor and the crosstown streets all the way from 19th through 23rd, 24th streets. It was huge. I'm just making a point that that 500-foot radius is not adequate. Thanks.
All right, I think everyone's clear. 500 feet is not adequate, but I'm not hearing a solution, folks. Come on now, give me some help here. David.
Well, yes, you did. You heard someone. I think it was Brad who said no. It wasn't Brad.
What I'm hearing is it's the traditional. David, I want to ask you clarification. I think you were called upon as our historian to tell us what is the traditional block length. Is that 800 feet? Is 500 feet?
Yeah, the part that a building stands on, like London Terrace, is 800 feet by 200 feet. Streets are 60 feet wide, and avenues, I think, are 80 feet wide. So if you technically on the same stretch of an individual street between two avenues, you could have two shelters that were 500 feet apart and near either end of the block.
Right. Okay. So if we change the language to the traditional block length of 800 feet as a radius, but no two on the same block. So that avoids then, is that Fred shaking his head no? Carrie's shaking her head no.
Paul, I mean, if I will propose something, if the board would like me to, I would say it cannot be within 5 blocks, east, west, south, north, or south within an area. I mean, you know, that's still close to me, but I'll propose that.
My thinking is if you take a street like 18th Street and you say 500 feet, same block, you could have, you know, the 200 block is 1 block, and then, you know, halfway down that and halfway down the 300 block, and everybody congregates on 8th Avenue, and then you have a massive problem. So I just am, I'm like spatially terrible, but, and maybe 5 avenues is too much, you know, and maybe it's 5 blocks, 5 city blocks and an avenue or 2 avenues. I don't know what that actually means in square footage or footage.
Yeah. Okay. Bert?
I say 2,000 feet.
2,000 feet.
Right. If one avenue block is 800, 2 avenue blocks is 1,600. So that covers 2 blocks at least. And then that's east-west. And then north-south, God knows how many streets it covers.
Well, David can tell you.
You know, part of the problem is when you're talking about blocks, do you mean north-south where they're 260 feet on center?
I said,
Bart, you got muted in the middle of your statement.
East-west, and I said, God knows how many north-south. I'd leave that up to you, David.
I'm just going to point out, people of the public, I'm only keeping conversations with committee members now, so thank you. So Bert, you're saying 2,000.
Right. As something, rather than 5 blocks or this or that, a specific street, a specific linear foot, and which is different. East-west, we're talking at least a little bit more than 2 blocks. And north-south, David, did you do the calculation?
North-south, it would be 7.7 blocks.
That sounds a good chunk.
Or it would be, we do it like the liquor license, door to door, front door to front door.
That's a good addition there, Mike. Door to door.
Thank you.
All right, so
Sorry, but I just want to throw in schools one more time. Like, I think we have to have a safety, you know, how many blocks from a school as well.
Yeah, and Carrie, I'm going to have the same reaction that Bert had to that in terms of how do we do that respectfully of the general homeless population, right? Like, I understand there are complications. I mean, I think that's why I picked up on the sex offender issues, because from what I understand is that sex offenders need to register and can't be living within a certain proximity to a school. So if we can make that a component of any shelter services, has to confirm that no sex offender would reside within a proximity of the school based on their current rules, right? That will help thin out. It's the way I was thinking about it.
Can we say what Bert said? Oh, sorry. I don't know why that's happening. Can we say what Bert said, but also something like not within 500 feet of a school, like a liquor license as well?
Jesse wants to address that.
I mean, this currently isn't the rule. I mean, we have pre-pandemic, we had a Care for the Homeless shelter across from PS 111 that was been a shelter for, before my time, and so, and it's currently a shelter, and when COVID ends, it's going to come back. And, so I think there's just no standing on it, to my understanding. So
yeah, okay.
That's the only, it just wouldn't be, we would then have to be looking back at all of the other, the existing shelters that we have and clarifying whether that's, meeting that requirement or not.
Okay. Thanks, Jesse. Twee?
Just taking it back a little bit to real numbers for Carrie. BRC is on 25th between 6th and 7th. FIT High School is on 24th between 7th and 8th. And also across from FIT High School is the Christopher, which is having to do with breaking ground. So with the density here, there is no real getting around it. I agree with Jesse about that. But I want to also go through numbers with Bert, I guess. If we say 2,000 feet and we say it's 2.5 avenues, so 23rd and 6th Avenue, that means we can have one on that corner, and then the next one won't be until the middle of the block of 8th Avenue and 23rd Street. That's what we're saying. Or we're saying 23rd and 6th, or let's say 23rd and 7th Avenue, and we can go up 7.7 blocks to almost 20 or 30th Street and 7th Avenue. That's what we're trying to say in terms of distance. That doesn't leave a lot of room within this whole area unless you're talking about large buildings that we were discussing, 500 units, of which, a component of the affordable, sustainable, and homeless is, right? So that's really the only way to get around it. We have to think about it like the algorithm of it, right? To make sure it will really fit within this map that we're working on.
Yeah.
My assumption, and tell me if I'm wrong, that this 2,000 or whatever we decide is only a metric to limit homeless shelters. It's not applicable to supportive housing or affordable housing that includes apartments for formerly homeless people that are referred there. Or is this supposed to cover everybody, all these kind of developments? Oh, I thought we were just talking about shelters.
No, it addresses homeless shelter conversions and supportive housing conversions, but that radius is not in the formula for affordable housing conversions. So only shelters and supportive service is the one where we'll have this radius on it.
It is kind of limiting. I'm listening to Twee and I'm kind of agreeing with her when I hear that it's also going to be applied to supportive housing, because I see supportive housing differently.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen. What I can do is go back to Joe and say, okay, Chelsea Land Use wants a 2,000 foot radius. You're putting a 500 foot radius, and let's see what we think is reasonable and feasible to get into our letter. And then this letter will come up to full board. And I'm sure there'll be more conversation about that at full board.
There's just too many working parts in here, Paul. Like, the buildings that we've been able to identify, like those distances between each other too. Can those be converted or not? And then using these new parameters, and then density of new buildings or new developments, the height.
Absolutely right, Twee. There's so many components to this. And I think that goes back to Kit's point about sort of what we're trying to do is set up some parameters. And then when the city or state comes in and says, okay, this is a distressed property we want to acquire, we can say, wait a minute, this is too close to other services. Doesn't reach medical facilities. You might have sex offenders next to a school. Like that gives us the negotiation point on those multiple layers. And what we're trying to avoid is the situation we had in the West 30s, right? So it's a larger scale kind of thought process. And that's why this letter is sort of nebulous, all right? And again, the city or state might just say, we have a distressed property. The Savoy Hotel is distressed, we're buying it, and we don't care what you say, right? And then, so we're trying to push that discussion forward and be proactive in those discussions. David?
Yeah, I'm thinking it might be worthwhile sort of testing some of these radii on the candidate buildings that we found. And you might find that, 2,000, all of a sudden you really don't have any candidates left. Maybe at 1,000, you do still have quite a few, as opposed to say 500. So I think there's a point at which it might just become kind of impractical to have too big a radius given the individual buildings that we've got and the kind of uniqueness of the neighborhood.
Right, and I think, David, that brings up the important kind of component that we don't want to have the restriction be so high that we come across saying, we want to work with you. You have to do 2,000 feet, and then we look at the map and 0 come into the district, right? Then the city's going to tell us that we're not being realistic. So I think that's
right.
a good strategy, David. Thank you. All right, so let me recap what the points are that we want to incorporate into the letter, and I'll work on these edits. Pam, you wanted to say more? You have to unmute, ma'am. Pam.
Sorry about that. Just quickly, is there any way to separate the supportive housing from just the flat out shelters? Because Chelsea has a number of small supportive housing locations that have been peaceful and quiet for many, many years. It's never been an issue in the community. But the shelters, particularly when there are no services offered, are a huge impact. They are by virtue of the way shelters work, the people who come and go pretty quickly. So there's no way to establish a real relationship among those people and people in the community. Is there a way to separate those two and make it the say 800 feet distance? I understand the difference between the vertical blocks and the horizontal blocks, and that is an issue.
So you're suggesting that we have a higher radius, higher footage for shelters versus affordable versus supportive housing.
Supportive and affordable, yes.
So
yes,
affordable, we don't have this discussion, right? So
right, okay.
The distance is for shelters and for supportive housing. So you're suggesting maybe we do 1,000 feet for shelters and 500 feet for supportive housing.
Something like that, whatever the numbers are. But yes,
whatever the numbers are.
Can we separate the?
Yeah, it is in the letter separated. We just had the same language in both sections. So I think that if we want to come up with a decision on that and say, for shelters, we want a 1,600 foot or 2,000 foot radius, and for supportive housing, where we want 750 or 1,000 feet. Like, I think that's we can certainly make that recommendation.
That's doable. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's in the, we have them separated in the letter already, so the distances can be separated as well. Twee?
Yeah, I still need clarification. I'm looking at it. The same language is there. New shelters shall not be located in proximity to existing shelters, social services and other supportive housing with a larger radius. Supportive housing says new supportive housing should not be located in proximity to existing shelters, social service facilities and other new supportive housing within a smaller radius. So to have an identical language seems a little strange because they're both really, one's farther, homeless shelters are going to be farther away from existing shelters and all the other housing, closer, and then new supportive housing is farther from existing shelters and other supportive housing. It doesn't make sense.
So what's your recommendation?
I don't like the idea of separating the distances because that seems a little, shall we say, civil rights era segregative. And it's just, if the goal is to have distance from existing shelters in order to have it spaced out, then it should be just one thing versus all of them, because otherwise it's a little confusing or overlapping.
Pam, what's your reaction to that? You're the one who made the recommendation.
I get Tweed's point, and I'm in sympathy with it. I don't know how to solve the question, so I'm afraid you can't look to me for an answer. Somebody else smarter than I am will have to figure it out.
All right.
But I think the point is sensible, reasonable. So that's it.
All right. I'm gonna go back and have a conversation with Joe about this, and I'm gonna use the average city block is 800 feet. We want to be closer to 2,000, 1,600. The 500 is too small, and so let's raise that number to some number that seems reasonable. And I'll have a conversation with Joe about it and see if we can't get to a better number there that makes sense. That's a reasonable argument to make to the city. I've heard what people are saying, something on one corner, another corner, that's 500 feet, that's two on the same block. People running along like these side streets like 18th Street, where if you have somebody between the western edge of 6th and 7th and the eastern edge of 8th and 9th, they're too close to each other on a street like 18th where it's mostly residential. So I'll try to navigate through and find a way to increase the number from 500. And to David's point, I don't know that we'll get to 2,000 because that would then wipe out the entire district. So let's see if I can't get a better number. All right. So looking at all the other changes then, is that acceptable to everybody that we go for higher than 500, 2,000 might be pushing it too high.
No, I mean, it's a letter that's a joint letter with Clinton Hell's Kitchen and Chelsea Land Use. So we have to get something that's comfortable with both committees.
Leave yourself some wiggle room.
I'm gonna start my negotiations at 2,500. If they're at 500, I'll start it. But I'll work with Joe and try to see if we can come up with a better number. So then the other change, one other issue that came up that there was a slight back and forth on, I don't feel like there was a resolution, is on Bert's point about the housing lottery for local workers as well as local residents. Twee objected to that. Bert proposed it. Can I just see a show of hands? How many people say local workers should be included in a preference for the lottery? Local workers, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Local work 5. Local workers, no. 1, 2,
no.
3, 4, 5. Damn it, Betty, you didn't vote. You get to make the decision.
No, I voted. I didn't. I don't want the workers.
All right. So
No,
I'm not going to add that in. All right. All right. To run through the rest of the issues then. Brad's point about making sure that we emphasize on-site issues for support serve for on-site offices and for on-site security. The distance issue, I think we've hashed through. 500 is not enough. 2,000 might be too much, but find some number in between. Maybe making note of the fact that shelter services should pay attention to sex offenders within the shelters so that they're not violating their own rules about proximity to schools. We're going to find some way to put language in the general principles about our preferences for families, for veterans, and then for individuals as the third tier. We want to make sure that we are looking into medical facilities and the proximity of these to medical facilities, and whether they're close by, or if there is retail or commercial space on the ground floor, that we look at some medical facility or urgent care site on site within the building. In the lottery for the local, I'm striking that Kit, the point of where else has this been done? Is there other people that have done this? Let's find out where we've been successful and let's not recreate the wheel if we don't have to. And that was my list. Did I miss anything? Marty, are you clapping or are you raising your hand with a point? Oh, thumbs up. Okay. All right. Kit.
I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but just want to quickly say, I think when we're creating the distance filter, that can't be 500, but it also can't be too big, because then we don't actually get any sites. We kind of need to have a perspective on how many sites should we really have and how many beds should those sites have in total. That's my 3-year-old saying, don't interrupt me. And so, Paul, you may be already thinking this, Joe may already be thinking this, but that's really not very polite, Sonoma. Thank you. We probably need to have a fair-minded number for both of those things, for what, doing our part for the city looks like in terms of number of sites and number of beds. And the filter should be designed to get us to that target. It's not going to be an exact science. It's probably more of an art. But I think it's a lot better than just sort of pulling a number out of the air.
And then I don't know, what about saying something about schools? That was mentioned a couple of times. Do we want to say something about that?
No, I think that the way that we kind of drew on that based on Bert's reaction was that we look at the service providers, make sure that any sex offenders within the shelters are not violating
so
their
we're
own
doing
laws
the
of
sex
proximity.
offender thing, not mentioning about proximity of schools. Okay.
Yeah, I think that because of the history of shelters and supportive service locations and affordable housing components all being currently close to schools, it's hard for us to say, don't put them near schools. So we want to try to find a balancing way.
All right. Okay. Okay. We got it covered.
All right. And Kit, anytime your 3-year-old wants to come to a meeting and tell everybody to shush, I'm okay.
You're going to wish you could take that back if I bring her to our next meeting.
You got to make it a master of arms here.
All right.
Order.
So just to make this official, since we are recorded and we are live, can I get a motion to accept the proposed changes on the letter as dictated and to negotiate with Hell's Kitchen to present a joint letter to the full board at the next meeting? Kit was first, Bert was second.
Okay.
Thank you very much. All
No,
right.
no. Sorry, Paul. Kit needs to actually make that motion. He doesn't have to
Motion to do what Paul said.
Second.
Kit, can you make the motion then, please?
Oh, sorry, I was talking over you. I said motion to do what Paul said.
And then Carrie seconded that.
Second.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, good.
Cool. Thanks. All right. I know.
Now we have to vote.
Oh,
don't
we vote.
Yeah. All right. I'm sorry.
Oh, vote.
Thanks. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstain? Anybody present not eligible?
Can I just clarify, Elzora, you're on. I don't think we heard from you if you're still listening. Okay. So that's unanimous for all the people that are here that are present that voted. Is that correct? That's what
Terrific.
Okay.
That's correct.
All right.
All right. Next issue on the agenda, and I know it's getting late, so this one shouldn't take that much time. The Empire Station Complex, our new proposed 20 million square feet of office space. This shouldn't take any time at all to discuss, should it? So there was a question that came up why the Community Board 4's letter on Empire Station Complex was tabled at our last meeting and what's going on with that. So I just want to let you know what's happening and why everything has been tabled, and it's actually good news. So the original hearing was scheduled for March 29th. The community got into an uproar. The elected officials were met with, and representatives from both Community Boards 4 and 5 got all the elected officials to sing in unison. So from Corey, Brad, Dick, Robert Jackson, Jerry Nadler, Gail Brewer, all basically stood with us and said, no, this process is backwards. You have the office development plan before you have the full transportation plan, and we need to have more community input before you can make the call. That was very effective. And at this point, the process has been, I don't like, we're not liking the word pause, but I'm going to say that the brake has been applied to the train that was running down the track. So the Community Advisory Committee has now been doubled in size. We've added on more members of the community, including 4 members now from each community board as opposed to 1. We've added a landmarks conservancy person. We've added on a climate justice person. We've added on some block association people. So the size of the Community Advisory Committee has doubled to include much more community input. And the first components, those meetings are now going to be scheduled weekly for the next 10 to 12 weeks. So we are now looking at a potential slowdown of this proposal by at least 10 weeks before we have another hearing on this. So the reason we didn't do the letter is because the public comment period is open right now. The hearing will be scheduled at some point in the future, and then that deadline for comments will happen some point in the future after that. So we wanted to hold off on writing what we were going to write until we knew where we stood with the project. So the good news is that the original plan did not include an affordable housing component. We've now added that as an alternative to be considered. The original plan was going to have its hearing on March 29th, and comments were going to end close to soon after that. We now have an open-ended comment period with a date undetermined as to when that will happen. So from Community Board 4, the representatives on this Community Advisory Committee, Jeffrey LaFrancois, as first vice chair, was always on. We've now added Lowell. We've added Christine Berthet from Transportation, and we've added me from Chelsea Land Use. Betty will be my source of backup and my spine. So anytime I have trouble, I'm going to call on Betty. So that's kind of,
fine with me.
it's like I get so. So any questions on Empire Station Complex and where we stand? I think Mike's hand was up first, then Brad, then Twee. Mike.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that the budget was not approved for anything beyond transportation matters, right?
Right, Mike, thank you.
All the budget money has to go now to redevelopment of Penn Station, basically below ground as it is, below ground. So that's really where it happened. Okay, it was not so much about to us as it was to recognizing that it is indeed a transportation project rather than combined residential and transportation budget.
Right, that 1.3 billion that got into the budget from the governor was sort of that compromise position that right. he originally wanted it to go to the overall complex. And between Dick and Brad and Robert and Liz Kruger and Robert Jackson, they did negotiate that 1.3 billion that the governor wanted in the budget would be earmarked solely for below grade transportation issues alone. But that being said, Mike, that doesn't preclude problems still at the block with St. John the Baptist Church on it, because the Penn Station self-expansion is into those blocks, and that money could still go for that expansion. And then we worry about what happens above grade and how they do the work below grade. So we still have to watch that.
Oh, I understand that. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that there was another constraint here, and it's monetary.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it was a big coup. It was a big coup on our part. Yeah. I think Brad was next.
That's great to hear, Paul. Thanks for the work. I would say one thing that's missing from that committee is a futurist, or what we received last week on the Parks Department from Vern's students that came up with great forward-thinking plans for some of our peers on the West Side. And, you know, we need people with vision on this, not to think of we're building another Hudson Yards. And I just don't want to miss this opportunity for the city of New York. It's like it's like the High Line. Those two had the vision. If those two didn't push and come up with something, it would all be knocked down, and Chelsea would be a whole nother vibe now. We have a great opportunity here. I don't look at it as a problem, but I just think that's lacking from the board. You know, they presented bricks and mortar. There's no forward thinking, zero. And I would really push the board, or to have one of the NYU somebody present some future presentations on what could be done there and accommodate, you know, a lot of things. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Brad. And I will point out that we do have now some climate justice people, and we do have some architectural design people from NYU and I think the New School. So we're inching closer to where you want to be. Twee?
Yes, thank you. You partially answered my question because you went really fast, but I'm glad that it doubled in size. It wasn't clear doubled from what number to what number, but just that there's 4 each from each community board, 4 and 5, one block association person, 1 environmental person, and now it's architect from NYU school. So I wasn't sure what else was there.
Yeah, it was around 20, and we've added another 20.
Okay.
So the list will be, and that list is being confirmed by ESD at this point. So it's not fully public consumption yet as to which individuals are on and which ones are not. I do know that the 4 community board members from each of the community boards has been accepted, and they have accepted the positions.
Okay,
so
and
everybody has to get invited, and then they have to accept, and then it'll be published on the website.
okay, and then when the March 29 date became an open-ended comment period, what does that mean? Is that for the public, or how do people make comments?
Anybody can go on, and there's a comment period, and Jess, you might correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think they left the comment period open, so you can go onto the ESD website, pull up Empire Station Complex, and read the 2,000-page document and put in comments. Now, I know that a lot of people here did, like David and Pam sent me some stuff on historic resources, and Carrie sent me some stuff on neighborhood context. And so we have some of that already written out, but we didn't submit anything yet. But I believe you can go on the website and submit things now.
Okay, just so that the public knows. And then
Yeah,
for the
in terms of alerting the public though, Twee, I would suggest that once we have the hearing date and we know where the draft EIS stands in terms of the work of the advisory committee, that then we will then push for that sort of public comment to occur.
And then in the meantime, the weekly meetings that are for 10 to 12 weeks, is that sort of internal among the 40 people versus what we're doing today?
Correct. It's an internal group, not public. It'll be for us to discuss those various issues. It's not a public meeting. It's not a public process at this point. That will become public. There will be a public hearing, but this part of the process is not public.
Okay, thank you.
Mike?
No, that's the old hand. Thank you.
Okay, great. Jesse, did I misrepresent anything that you're aware of? Did I overspeak and reveal too much, which is my tendency?
At this point, it's okay. Don't worry about it. No, I think you did fine. That was great.
Okay. So there's no vote, no action on that item. Just wanted to present so people, and if anybody has any other comments, feel free to send them to me, because I'll be on those weekly meetings for 2 hours every Tuesday, and Betty won't. All right. Anybody else have any other issues to raise? David.
Are we talking still about the station complex or new business?
I'm done with the station complex.
Okay, new business. I would just like to mention, we wrote the letter about the stair at Lehigh building and the rooftop equipment that was proposed for the top. And Betty and Pamela and I walked all the way around the building from many blocks away and looked at its impact. And Brad weighed in. We agreed that the equipment was, it wasn't emergency equipment. It was equipment that could go elsewhere, even inside the building, and that it really had a disruptive impact, violating the original design intent of the building and even a year 2000 master plan. And we wrote a very good letter to the Landmarks Commission, and Pamela actually addressed the commission in the public hearing. I know you watched it live, Paul. I watched it afterwards on YouTube. And the reason we had Pamela speak was to make sure that the message got across to the commissioners, because we're not always sure that they read our letters. So Pamela read really the heart of the letter out loud. And, just before the commissioners began discussing the project, Fred Bland, who was sort of leading at that moment, asked Rich Stein, who's the staffer at Landmarks, who runs the meetings, if anything had been heard from Community Board 4. And Rich said, Pamela Wolf just read Community Board 4's letter. And, Pamela quoted the letter to the effect that Community Board 4 recommends denial. And she had just summarized all the reasons. And, there was no, as the discussion went forward, there was no discussion of our letter whatsoever. And, I'd have been satisfied if they had talked about it for a sentence or two and said, well, Community Board 4, they're ultra sensitive, we don't agree with them. But it just went into a waste can. And, it was clear that that they weren't even listening to Pamela speak. So, I'm considering whether we don't want to send the commission a letter pointing out that this happened. I think they should be embarrassed. But, maybe it could be constructive criticism and put the shame that they should be feeling to some good end, because, Pamela and Betty and I really invested a fair amount of time. And it seems to me like maybe we're just providing a fig leaf of public participation where there isn't any real public participation for the Landmarks Commission.
David, so as communication between you, me, and Betty indicated, this is an issue that we think needs to be discussed in the next presentation for Landmarks Preservation Committee issues. I will point out to the other members something you did not point out, which is that when the developer made their proposal, they specifically mentioned Community Board 4's input and altered the generator size based on Community Board input. So it is very clear from when I watched it that the Community Board's input was heard by the developer and was raised to the commissioners. So what I'd like to ask is that we table this discussion until the time at our next LPC letter, we come up with a stronger strategy as to how we better present to guarantee that our voices are heard.
Right, so will that be in the next meeting?
It'll be the next opportunity that LPC has an application and we decide we want to approach LPC on an issue. We will discuss how we better frame our statements and our public testimony to make sure that we're better heard.
Well, I don't understand why we would wait, especially it seems to make sense to strike kind of while the iron is hot. That's a recent event in people's memories.
Because David, Betty and I are not in agreement with you that they did not hear, and we are not in agreement that we should send a letter to a commission saying we want to chastise you for not preparing yourself for a meeting by reading the letters in advance. So we will table this discussion until a later date.
May I have one thing to say here in this
Please.
discussion?
Yep, thank you.
Of something that David didn't mention. Commissioner Carroll went off, her internet failed just at the beginning of our testimony, just before it, and did not come back online until after it. So the commissioner never heard our letter read into the testimony in the meeting. That is the reason that when she did manage to get back on into the meeting, she asked Fred Bland to please take over because she was not able to respond to anything. That's what happened. Just
Yeah.
wanted to make that
Yes.
clear. And Paul, I think you need to ease up a little bit. I think it is important. I think that Chelsea Land Use is in a position to make a statement to the commission, and that it should be made, and it should be made promptly. Thank you.
All right, I have suggested we table this conversation. I do think that to write a letter to a commission saying that the chair's connection to the internet was interrupted at the beginning of the meeting, and to be critical of that does not work to our advantage, since that happened to us just now tonight. So I want to be very careful about how we approach LPC, and I am open to suggestions and thoughts on how to be more effective in the way we communicate with LPC to continue our successes as we have in the past. We have had great success with LPC. On this issue, we were not as successful. And I agree that we need to find a better way to do that.
I think that the fact that they did manage to lower, they demonstrated that they lowered was by something like 16 inches. They were, you know, I mean, on something
On a
that's
17-foot addition.
No, I'm sorry, 27 foot
27
addition.
feet, yeah.
Vertically 27 feet, 50 feet horizontally, 27 feet vertically, and they took 16 inches off. I think that was the lost leader.
Brad? No, you're muted, Brad.
Am I to understand that they allowed it?
Yeah, they approved it without, and to David's point, they approved it without conversation. Like they just, they had the presentation, Pamela read our letter, and then it came up for a vote and there was no discussion at all. It was approved unanimously. They changed the color of the paint.
Yeah, they had their behind the scenes meeting, they presented, and it was already decided. When you ask for suggestions on some, as a possibility, not to call anybody out, but maybe a possibility, Chair, is that there's a letter written saying, in order to help you, the landmarks, what is the proper procedure to, you know, something to show that we want to be engaged with them, but we're also kind of keen that, you know, are you hearing us? I'm not saying you're wrong, Paul, but maybe that's a way to send something to them to know, wow, these guys are definitely honest again. I don't know, but maybe that's a way of addressing it with them. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And as I say, I do think that I would like to find a way to have our voices be more effective with LPC.
What about, Paul, what if we did the outreach?
We're kind of having the discussion now at 8:45. So I think that we think it would be better when we have our brains not so tired and we could have a discussion at another meeting. It's been a long night, and I think maybe Pam and David and Brad, you're creative people. Maybe there's some more creative way we can approach LPC when we really feel strongly about something. And I don't know.
Well, should we put it on the agenda for a next meeting?
Well, I don't know whether it's, what do you think, Paul?
I'm happy to put it on absolutely, but I don't want to put it on, I don't want to commit to the next month's agenda if next month's agenda has 400 things on it, right? Like I want to give this substantive conversation and substantive time. And so I'm amenable to saying next month's agenda, but let's look at next month's agenda before we do it. And then if in fact something that comes up that has to go to LPC before we can actually accomplish this conversation we need to have, that will then force it onto an agenda. Is that acceptable? Like I don't want to commit to next month.
Well, we don't know what is on the agenda for next month.
500 things are on the agenda, and we were, you know, I just want to be reasonable. I want to give this appropriate due and appropriate conversation.
Can I say something? And it's not facetious.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like we need a lobbyist almost to get to these people. So if anybody knows a lobbyist as a friend, I'm not kidding.
No,
Say, what
I,
do we do
listen,
here? I mean,
the developers have lobbyists. That's how they get there.
we've been dealing with this
So
for
let's,
years. How do you get them to listen to us, for God's sake?
yeah. All right. So let's say yes to putting it on next month's agenda with the caveat that if there's a lot of other issues that we're not going to have time enough to really dig into this, that we move it to the next one. Unless there's something for LPC on next month's agenda, then we have to have this conversation before we go back to LPC again. Is that?
That
Fine
seems
with
like
that.
a good strategy. And maybe those who are passionate about this can think of creative ideas on this. You know, I don't have the money for a lobbyist, but there's.
And David and Pam, I will be inoculated, twice vaccinated and inoculated by middle of May. And I'd be happy to come down and chat, sit with you with coffee, go through all of our thoughts on this and come up with a good, solid, aggressive plan. Because I agree, it needs to be addressed. I just don't think that this is the moment to address this particular issue.
It also will be, as the politics goes, we have a district manager who's quite good at it. And there might be a way to talk to somebody where, you know, when people like to talk about themselves, they tend to like us. So if they came and presented to us and we got to know them a little bit better, maybe that's just a friendly way to deal with them. To say we're passionate like you are, and we could come together on some things. And maybe that's just a better way of handling it.
So
that's what I'm suggesting. You know, you send a spy into their camp and you talk to them.
So you're saying, Brad, invite LPC to come to a Chelsea land use meeting to do a presentation on their process and their issues.
Just their process, or hey, you guys
might be
deal
the
with
way to do
community
it.
boards all the time. What do you like to see from us? What really does help from you? We're listening to them. And then when we are really passionate about something, we say, listen, this one we really got to talk to you about. You know, something in that vein where, you know, we're in this with them. We're not trying to, you know, we're trying to do the same thing they are. So maybe it's a way to communicate. And, you know, there's a lot of Zoom right now. So they have time to come present to us, and they might get something out of it, and we might get something out of it.
They have a community liaison.
But I mean, that's good. You know, that's a start. Jesse might know somebody in there a little higher up. You know, I think there's some people on the Hudson River Trust that know some people. I mean, who knows?
Okay, that's a positive way we should wrap this up. Right? Thank you, Brad.
Thank
Do
you.
we hear a motion to adjourn?
Yeah, I'm going to first apologize if my tone got a little sharp because it is late and my dinner is getting cold on the stove. So I apologize to everybody. Thank you very much.
Accepted.
Motion to adjourn, anybody?
Have a good dinner, Paul.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Good night.